Good morning or good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome to all of you for joining us today. My name is Jing Li. I'm the director of the Jack Austin Center and a professor of international business at Simon Fraser University. On behalf of the Jack Austin Center for Asia Pacific Business Studies, I welcome you to this exciting book launch event. The book, The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism, explores fundamental issues across a diverse set of Asian countries about their economic rights, the challenges they face, and the policy recommendations. Today, we have four distinguished speakers, Professor Simon Commander and Professor Saul Estrin, who are the authors of the book, Senator Yuen Pau Woo and Professor Preet Aulakh, who will serve as commentators. Before the authors present their book, let me introduce them. Dr. Simon Commander is a managing partner of Altura Partners, providing policy advice to governments and companies in emerging economies. He's also visiting professor of economics at IE Business School in Madrid. From 1998 to 2011, he worked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development in London, and from 1988 to 1998 at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. Professor Saul Estrin was the founding head of the Department of Management at London School of Economics, and formerly professor of economics and associate dean at London Business School. He researches international business and entrepreneurship, especially with reference to emerging economies. He's former president of the European Association for Comparative Economic Systems and a fellow of the Academy of International Business. Without further ado, let us welcome the authors to present their book for about 25 minutes. And the audience, please type your question in the Q&A box anytime. So Simon and Saul, the microphone is now yours.
Okay. Well, I'm going to start. I'm Simon Commander. Thank you very much, Jing, for that very nice introduction. And it's an honor and a pleasure to be here to talk about our new book. This it is. I hope people can see it. It's published by Cambridge University Press. It was out in the UK and Europe at the end of last year and has been now published in North America in February, in this month. Now, the book is about something that should be, if not dear to our hearts, then certainly important to all of us. It's really about what's made Asia the great success story of the last 50 years, because there's no doubt it is, what's likely to be Asia's future, and in thinking about that, what are the sorts of fragilities that have been exposed by Asia's successful growth model, and how can they be addressed? So the obviousness of the importance of the issue, comes from any aggregate statistic. Asia, after all, accounts for 60% of the world's population, north of 40% of the world GDP, and so on and so on. So you'd have to be interested in this place. And for the purposes of the book and for our discussion today, what we mean by Asia is really, I suppose, what we might call middle-income Asia. In other words, China, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on and so on. We include South Korea in there as well, and implicitly the early Asian success stories like Taiwan and Singapore. But really the book is about, for the most part, middle-income Asia. So it really doesn't have an awful lot to say about Laos, Cambodia, Kampuchea, Nepal, and so on. Now, when we look at Asia's extraordinary growth, it's absolutely apparent that they've got there using a different set of policies and a different policy mix than most of the advanced countries did when they became rich, as it were. And the differences are not just about how public policy is designed, for instance, the use of industrial policy, explicit or tacit, but also the framework in which that has been exercised, and in particular, how the corporate world, how the business world is configured. For Asia has something not entirely unique, but certainly very, very different from what exists in the rich world, and that is the Asian business groups. And they exist are important and highly persistent and cut across countries and cultures. And we argue in the book that, in effect, this combination of public policy, sometimes very explicit, sometimes more tacit, with these business groups has led to a form of economic, a form of coordination that has allowed many Asian economies to solve many of the problems of economic development in a rather successful way. However, we also argue in the book that the basis of this, which are networks of connections that run between politics, politicians, and business, and which are very heavily embedded right throughout Asia, these sort of networks of connections, we call them the connections world, may have delivered the coordination and the growth and the development that we have observed so far, but that looking forward, there are more problems in store. And the book is really about that. And the tone of our book is extremely, it's not to be critical, to downplay. It's to basically argue how, in a way, can Asia continue to be the great success that we know it has been. Now, just to put it in very simple framework, in the connections world, at the apex of it sit two broad bunches of people. On the right-hand side, or I'm facing the screen, you have businesses and business groups. On the left, you have politicians, political parties, and they have very transactional relationships, sometimes with some reciprocity, sometimes without. The businesses look to get public contracts, they look to get licenses and regulatory discretion exercised on their behalf. After all, most sectors, telecoms, mining, you name it, you need a license in most of these countries. They often look for subsidies or transfers, bank finance, particularly from state-owned banks, and so on. Politicians and political parties look to get sinecures, donations to their parties or to themselves, sometimes legal, sometimes illegal. They look also for businesses to create jobs for their constituents, particularly in sensitive industries or at sensitive times. So that, in a sense, is the apex, the two groups at the top of this transactional pile and the sorts of things that they deal with each other about. And the book chronicles that in considerable detail. Now, we argue that these networks that bind, and they bind together powerfully, and they're much more important than just cronyism. It's not that I know Saul and he scratches my back and I scratch his back, so to speak. It's that these are whole networks, and they may have ethnic components, they may have regional components, they may have political components, they may have simply commercial components. But these webs operate with a lot of common purpose and common modes of functioning. And these cut across political systems, whether they be the autocracies of East Asia or the sort of various democracies of South Asia. Now, the shape of these networks and how they work is obviously, although there's much similarity, it is obviously influenced by the broader political system and institutional format. And this is made clear, I think, in these two network maps. What are these maps? Well, as I face the screen on the left, the Cyclops eye is China, with the party at the center, a bunch of party members, also called politicians, around it, then a whole bunch of state-owned enterprises interspersed with private firms, as well as individuals. Now, there's so many observations there, something like 200,000, that you can't see the connections between them. This is taken off a database that we use in the book. But beneath that, there are a whole bunch of connections that link these groups and peoples together, as well as entities. On the right-hand side, quite different, is India, a parliamentary and, to some extent, although some would say perhaps decreasingly, a competitive democracy. There you have two big parties. By the way, this data is for 2018, the Congress and the BJP. If you reconfigured it for up till now, then one would be probably a bit larger, i.e. BJP, and the rest are regional or provincial parties. Again, some SOEs, the blue dots, and some private firms. And the scale is not because in these maps, a party or an individual is just one node, one similar, but the size of these nodes is scaled by the number of connections that they have. And that's why, of course, the parties and some of the firms have a lot more connections than others. So the institutional environment is important. Now, in this connection, obviously that from the point of view of linking up the politicians and the businesses, that a whole is quite diverse. There's state-owned enterprises, which by definition are highly politicized. There are some businesses, but very importantly and very differently from most countries, particularly the rich world, there are a lot of business groups. Now, what are these business groups? Well, they're mostly family, often dynastic, in other words, several generations. They're very diversified for the most part, and they hang around a hell of a lot. They don't go away. Once they get going, they stay there, even when the situation changes. And they're organized in that way to give them owners, the families, greater levels of control, which is facilitated by the disadvantage, making minority shareholders disadvantaged. The structures also allow tunneling. Owners can move resources around companies to meet their aims. And quite importantly, in the book, we say it's very good for deterring predators. And what do we mean by that? We mean other businesses who may want to acquire them or part of them, as well as politicians who may want to expropriate or predate on them in other ways. When you have these very complex structures, it's very hard to do both. Now, why are business groups around in Asia? And they have been for a lot. Well, most of us, economists, management people, think that this is because they can help address missing or incomplete markets, gaps, in other words. And those gaps may be for finance, capital, or they may be for management, skills, and the like. But it's also true to say that the business format of the business group is really very well suited for connecting to politics because they provide concentrated points of contact, they reduce complexity, they facilitate reciprocity gains, and as I said in the opening slide, they can be vehicles for national or developmental goals with coordination point. And that, in a sense, is a good aspect, clearly, and others may not be. Now, the consequence of all of this is that you would think that as countries got richer, institutions got better, as it were, and development proceeded, that these market gaps would shrink, and with them, business groups would go away, or at least get minimized. That's not the case at all. And in point of fact, we argue in the book that in a sense, the format being ideally suited for the connections world trumps the missing or incomplete market story. So there's another power and directive to it. And part of that is because business groups are very good at entrenching themselves. They build market share, they build power, and it's very hard to displace them, even when their political and other patrons shuffle off the scene. And in so doing, in concentrating their business power, they also concentrate enormous amounts of wealth. And nothing could be more striking than the fact that probably one of the most dynamic and impressive of all business groups in Asia, Samsung from South Korea, now, believe it or not, accounts for about 22% of South Korea's considerable GDP. Remember, South Korea income per capita is higher than Spanish income per capita. And this, although to a lesser extent, is true right through. Now, I'm going to skip a little bit on this. This is a slide about something that's very topical right now, which is the Adani Group. Adani is a very good example of a relatively nascent early business group expanding fast, leveraging connections to grow enormously. Market capitalization of the group rose by a quite extraordinary 4,000+% in the last 10 years. And that wasn't just because they were awfully good businesses, but in a sense, it's a reflection of their links to political power and the sorts of benefits that come with that. I won't spend more time on that because that's a complicated issue. We can come back to it in the discussion. So let me conclude and then pass over to Saul. The connections world has been beneficial for Asia, no doubt about it. But as incomes have risen, the connections world really become more entrenched. And the market gaps or missing markets explanation for why business groups are so powerful doesn't seem to really work very well. And with that entrenchment, there are essentially a bunch of so-called fallibilities or problems that are stored up. One is the attenuation or diminution of competition. Second is the limitations on the creation of good jobs, employment, in other words. The third, perhaps most importantly, is whether this connections world is going to be a fit vehicle for innovation. The fourth is the connections to weak or incompetent governments and to venality. And the fifth is about really inequality and the like. So without further ado, I hand over to Saul to take it forward.
Thanks, Simon. Simon's talked about, so to speak, the nature of the beast, right? This what we would call a political economy equilibrium between incumbent firms, which mainly business groups and politicians, which has, in our view, facilitated, more than facilitated in some cases, the remarkable growth in Asia. What I want to do now is look at the impact of, in more depth, the impact of these of this political economy equilibrium on the future of Asia, and then at the end try and wrap up with some policy points. I'm going to look at, of the 6 points Simon just mentioned, I'm only going to focus on 3: competition, employment, and innovation. And I'll obviously have to do that quite quickly. What is the frailty that the connections world gives us in terms of competition? Well, the answer essentially is that it creates monopoly power. The firms, the incumbents, are able to create barriers to entry, partly because of their enormous scale, partly because of the connections within the business group, which, as we said, has huge numbers of subsidiaries, covers lots of areas, and has an internal capital market, and quite often has an internal labour market. So there's a lot of monopoly power. But it also is often supported by, through the relationship with the political arena, it's supported by regulatory government actions, for example, restricting foreign entry by foreign direct investors, or entry indeed by domestic firms who can't get licenses, and so on and so forth. At the same time, the business group format allows a limitation of exit of inefficient firms, because if the business group wants to maintain firms, it just shifts the resources around to do so, and there's a lot of evidence that's going on. So if we think of growth increasingly relying on a process of Schumpeterian creative destruction, in which productivity is being driven up by new entrants coming in with high productivity and exit by firms with low productivity, this connections world essentially slows or eradicates those processes from occurring. Now, at the heart of our arguments is market power. And we want to think about market power in two ways. The first is that business groups are typically have very high market power in the very large number of specific markets in which they operate, quite often hundreds and hundreds of product markets simultaneously. We're not going to provide data on that. We're going to provide data on a more recent concept, which people are using to think about this, which is overall concentration. Now, overall concentration asks the question, since these groups are so diversified, what matters is not only their power market by market, but their power across all markets together. Now, in other words, if we think of the United States, for a moment, you might say, well, I'm a bit worried about, Google, because in the market for search, at least at this moment, it has something like a 70% market share. At the same time, if you look at the overall concentration rate of the United States, you'll find that the top 5 firms actually only produce about 3% of US GDP. So while firms have a lot of market power in certain markets, they don't particularly have a lot of power across the economy. This is simply not the case in Asia. If we look at the overall concentration ratio, and we simply ask about the top 5 firms, what you see is the top 5 firms in South Korea are generating around 30% of GDP, in Vietnam, 35%. And you can see there are other very high ones. Even in really gigantic economies, like, for example, India or China, these rates are in excess of 10% and 3 or 4 times the level we see in the United States. Exactly the same thing is even more, shows up even more sharply if we look at the 10-firm concentration ratio. And picking up on the important point that Simon was making, if you are a government and you are following an industrial policy which is active in favor of development, then you can actually have a big say in a place like Korea, or indeed in a place like China, on the whole economy by contacting 5 or 10 individuals. It makes coordination of economic development very easy. So you've got a lot of market power, both at the level of the market and at the level of the economy as a whole. Let's turn quickly to employment. Now, the employment problem is also a consequence of monopoly power, but it plays out rather differently. The business groups create jobs, but not that many jobs. It creates good jobs, high productivity jobs, but the rates of employment, for example, the employment share of the top 5 firms, which as we've seen in India and China, 10, 11, 12%, the employment shares are 1 or 2%. This is partly because they're very productive firms, but it's also because business groups don't tend to employ that many people. And they're not growing employment very much. So where are people working? Well, the answer for the most part across Asia is in the informal sector. And in the informal sector, you have low productivity, low skill, low security, low wage jobs. And so your development process is a dualist development process. And that is in part because of the market power and of the business groups, and because of the connection goods world that supports them. Turning quickly to innovation, this is a really big issue. The point about innovation is that increasingly Asia is going to have to move away from the extensive forms of growth that it's been following for the last 20, 30 years with such extraordinary success. That means ever-increasing reliance on innovation. Now, how well placed is Asia to get innovation given the structure of the connections world? Now, we would argue this is quite a nuanced story, and the book says a lot more. I'll say very briefly. First of all, it is important to say that business group affiliates do tend to innovate more than non-affiliates, as indeed they should. They concentrate the resources and they have the capacity to do so. It's not that these companies are necessarily not innovating. The issue here, or the issues here, arise essentially from the fact, from the monopoly pact. That is to say that increasingly these firms can be seen as rent-seeking, and that is not particularly supportive to the market of innovation. And the market power that they're able to exert prevents the trial and error processes that we see around innovation in so many places, and prevents the emergence of new firms. And in terms of evidence on this, well, sorry, just to repeat this point again. So what we're saying is that non-affiliated firms are crowded out from financing and from returns to innovation, and the connections world is suppressing entry and exit processes. What's the evidence on innovation in Asia? Because we hear a lot about, well, Asia's very innovative, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We do a very simple regression here in which we link R&D expenditure, which is one measure of innovativeness as a share of GDP, to GDP per capita controlling for the size of the economy. And what will stand out immediately to you is that none of the Asian economies, with the sole exception of South Korea, is a very innovative places given their level of development. And some of them, obviously, are punching rather below their weight. So there's not, and our reasoning behind that is essentially the monopoly power of business groups and the way the connections world embeds incumbents over potential entry. Well, what do we think is going to happen? We're not at all saying that Asia's growth is just going to stop or anything like that. Indeed, this is not really a forecast at all. What we're trying to do here is pin down a somewhat different angle on what are the true frailties, what are the true risks to economic development, further economic development in Asia. And they are, we believe, to do with the concentration of market power, to do with the concentrations which relate to it of wealth and inequality, to do with the dualistic economy, and to do with the fact that innovation, though it can occur without a doubt, we just have to look at China's improvement in terms of innovation in the last decade, or South Korea, but due to the fact that this structure is not terrifically well suited to create an innovative society. So what do we think about where we'll go? For Asia to advance, we believe the connections world has to be addressed explicitly. We believe it will not fade away naturally, because essentially the current players gain too much. Without going into detail, we can pick them up in the questions. We will argue that essentially, we argue in the book, that essentially the business world the connections world can be addressed partly by a series of policies to accelerate the disappearance or transformation of business groups into more regular sorts of organizations, and secondly, to limit the discretionary scope and incentives for politicians. And just to highlight, you might say, well, this is very unlikely, it's not in anyone's interest to do this. I would just make 2 points. The first is that in the United States under Roosevelt and in the UK under Harold Wilson, these business groups that were very pervasive and seemed to be part of the cause of the Great Depression in the United States, for example, were essentially eliminated by changes to corporate law. Moreover, I think there's a series of really innovative policies going on. I think we're not the only people to understand the frailties that arise from these issues. The South Korean government, I think, is probably the most aware. And the South Korean government is working quite hard, particularly with inheritance tax policy, to try and force business groups, large family-owned business groups, to break themselves up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saul and Simon, for a very insightful presentation. I think we have a question from the audience. Maybe it's good for you to address this quickly here, because it's mainly asking you to clarify even further about the diagrams. The one you have, I believe you have the beautiful pictures of networks. Left hand is China, the right hand is India. So the question is, does the left or right in the diagrams carry any connotations?
No, I mean, no, these are, in a sense, naive network maps. They basically just show how 5 types of entities or individuals connect or do not connect to each other. And so those are political parties, the dark red, the lighter red, politicians, black, individuals, blue, state-owned enterprises, and green, firms. And this is from a data set that lists all of these and explicitly identifies when they are connected to each other. So it's obviously no surprise that political parties are connected to politicians who belong to them, hence these circling round the political parties. But the data set also identifies, or can help identify, companies, private and state-owned, that are linked. So this is a way of describing what we call the connections world and the networks that are underneath it. So I hope that gives a sense of a good answer.
So just to be clear, the left-hand side picture is China. And one of the things you might be getting out of it is that at the center in China is the Communist Party. And connections in some sense all start with the Communist Party and go out from there. Whereas if you look at the India one on the right-hand side, though there is some concentration of power, essentially what you've got is you have different political networks and then business networks, and they're not super closely integrated in the way that China are, and they're not uniform in the way that China are. So these are simple maps of how networks work in different contexts.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for clarifying this. So now let me introduce Senator Woo, who will comment on the book for about 10 minutes. Appointed to the Senate of Canada in November 2016, the Honorable Yuen Pau Woo sits as independent representing British Columbia. He served as facilitator of the Independent Senators Group from 2017 to 2021. Senator Woo has worked on public policy issues related to Canada's relations with Asian countries for more than 30 years. From 2005 to 2014, he was president and CEO of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, during which he also served on the Standing Committee of the Pacific Economic Cooperation Council and as chair of PECC's State of the Region report. He is also senior fellow at Simon Fraser University's Graduate School of Business and a member of the Trilateral Commission. He also serves on the advisory boards of the Mossack Institute, the Canadian Ditchley Foundation, and the York Center for Asian Research. So without further ado, Senator Woo, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Jing. Good day to all of you. I appreciate the invitation from the Jack Austin Center to comment on this very stimulating book. And I want to start by congratulating Professors Commander and Estrin for producing this very timely volume. It comes as part of a long line of literature on the determinants, I guess, of Asian economic success. But in some senses, it's a bit of a retro approach to this literature, in that it has the ambition to look at Asia as a whole. Now, the authors are careful to point out that they focus principally on middle-income Asia, but the scope and the coverage of the book is indeed very broad and impressive, and it offers an explanation as well as a source of concern for Asia's economic development to date, as well as its future prospects, based on what they offer as a unifying concept, which is, of course, that of the connections world. It's reminiscent, of a lot of the discussion and literature that came out soon after the Asian financial crisis. Some of you are probably not old enough to remember that, but in 1997, there was a spectacular crash Asian economies, starting in Southeast Asia and rapidly spreading across East and Northeast Asia and South Asia as well. And in the aftermath of that crisis, there were many discussions that, as I say, connect with and which seem to be reprised in this volume. Discussions around the prevalence of corruption, of collusion, cronyism. This is a word also that Professors Commander and Professor Estrin use, and the reasons for the prevalence of these bads in the affected financial crisis economies. And one of the reasons discussed at the time, of course, was the presence of conglomerates closely intertwined with political elites, leading to suboptimal decisions that made their countries particularly vulnerable when financial market conditions change, when the exchange rate fell sharply or interest rates went up. And then, of course, exacerbated by the open capital markets that allowed capital to leave and resulting in countries as well as companies that were highly indebted to be very vulnerable. Post financial crisis, we had an outpouring of commentary on the Asian growth model, which raises many of the similar issues, many of the same issues that are in the connections world around for example, the observation of low, total factor productivity growth, the reliance on labor inputs, the reliance on foreign investment, technology transfer, the lack of innovation, the problem of corporate concentration, of course, cronyism, corruption, weak institutions, problems of protection in certain sectors, insufficient opening up of the economies, and so on and so forth. So that literature was prolific through the period of immediately following the Asian crisis, before as well, but there was a fresh outpouring. But much of that, I think, died down as we saw the rapid rebound of Asian economies within really 3, 4, 5 years of the Asian financial crisis. And instead, we pivoted, if you will, attention pivoted to back to the question of the success of Asian economies. This was a time, of course, also when China joined the WTO and entered an era of spectacular growth, which carried along the countries in the periphery of China, partly through the network of production, the supply chains that lifted all the countries from lower to higher standards of living. There arose then, really, in the 2 decades, I would say, following the Asian financial crisis, a kind of belief in perhaps Asian exceptionalism, China in particular, that there was some kind of magic formula, some special sauce that allowed China and other East Asian economies to produce such spectacular growth, to come out of such a severe financial crisis, and the attention given to some of the more fundamental structural challenges of these economies, I think, was dissipated somewhat. More recently, though, I think there is a return to the discussion of why some Asian economies, or how some Asian economies can move from the rapid growth they've achieved, attaining lower middle income or middle income status, to then take that leap into upper income status. This has been described as the middle income trap, and was a preoccupation, is still a preoccupation among many scholars and policymakers, particularly in places like China, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, to a lesser extent, Vietnam. So this book, in a sense, tries to answer the question of how Asia can escape the middle income trap. And it provides really a very fresh and innovative analytical lens with which to understand that question. And you've heard from the presenters already that the lens is this idea of the connections world, on the one hand, connections of business groups, and on the other hand, the connections of political groups. I congratulate and salute the authors for giving us this fresh way of thinking about it. It's augmented by this really remarkable data set and the production of some very unconventional graphics that I have to say really catch the eye. I do wonder, though, how far we can get with this analytical lens that they call the connections world, and whether it has sufficient analytical power to provide a deeper understanding of the consequences, of the results of the connections world that have to be solved. And Professors Commander and Estrin have gone through many of these problematic areas that connections have created, whether it is in the area of labor markets or innovation or competition, encouragement of entrepreneurship, and not to mention, of course, problems of corruption and graft. It's not clear to me whether further understanding of these problems that have been rightly raised and analyzed by the authors should be done and can be done by further developing a connections way of understanding the problems, or whether basically we have to dig even deeper using the traditional tools of management studies and political economy. The tools are familiar to those of you who are in the academy, studying human capital, studying entrepreneurship, studying institutional economics, the role of the state and regulatory capture, studying innovation systems, labor markets, competition policy, market power. I mean, all of these disciplines and sub-disciplines are very well advanced. Perhaps we need to put a finer lens, finer application of these tools with an understanding of how connections affect, for example, human capital formation, innovation, and so on. I started this commentary by expressing my pleasure and happiness that the authors took a pan-Asian approach, which is not that fashionable these days, because there is an awareness and a desire to try to look at the specificities of economic development and the political economy of Asian economies in their own right, rather than across the board. And one of my questions is for the authors is what is particularly Asian about this approach, and whether they are trying to offer some kind of pan-Asian explanation for both the emergence and the persistence of the connections world across very, very different countries, very different histories, very different backgrounds. I would also be interested to hear if they could think more and elaborate more perhaps on the ways in which connections have played a role in the economic development of other countries through the Industrial Revolution and previous phases of economic development in the West in particular. They've already alluded to trust busting in the United States and the ways in which a pathway might have already been carved for Asian economies to also move away or to diminish the role of business groups and political groups in the structure of the economies. But that in itself begs a question about convergence. And this is also a long-standing debate about whether, in fact, the application of Western solutions, which I think, if I may be very gross in this generalization, I think it's essentially what the authors are saying, that Asia needs to employ more Western governance practices. Whether this is in fact the solution that Asian economies should follow. And crucially, we have to interrogate whether Western governance practices have produced the kind of job growth, productivity enhancement, and innovation that have been satisfactory for industrialized economies. And I can tell you, in Canada, there is a long-standing question around why this country has had such low productivity performance over many, many years, in spite of a corporate governance and political governance model that tries to maximize the kinds of innovation and competitiveness and market entry and entrepreneurship that the theory would lead us to believe can come about. I would be interested to hear a bit more from the authors on the efforts at internal transformation of business groups. I have encountered many of them in my life, and followed the progress of many of the major family groups, particularly in Southeast Asia, where I'm from, and also to some extent in Hong Kong. And I do see all kinds of internal transformations, starting, of course, with the infusion of external talent in the senior ranks of leadership at these family-controlled firms. I mean, think of Hutchison Whampoa, for example, but the same would apply to all of the conglomerates, many of the conglomerates in Malaysia, Singapore, Charoen as well, Indonesia to a lesser extent. And whether we can get a better understanding of the trajectory of business groups based on the sorts of internal reforms that they are attempting. And one of those internal reforms, if you will, is, of course, that they are looking to internationalize the operations and to have international reach, but also international recognition. And I'm very interested to understand if going overseas, going global, if you will, forces a different kind of trajectory on these business groups that could be, well, good for them, obviously, but perhaps also good for the countries where they come from. And finally, because time is short, I'd be really interested to hear the thoughts of the authors on the ways in which the analytic model they've offered us, thinking about the connections world in both the political and the business realms, whether this how they would see this analytic framework further inform research in management studies, in studies of economic development at the micro, at the macro level. What should graduate students at Simon Fraser's BD School be thinking about should they want to build on this very innovative framework so that we can develop even more explanatory power, if you will, of what is really a very fresh idea to the literature. And with that, I again want to thank the authors for their contribution and thank SFU for giving me the opportunity to offer some comments. Back to you, Jing.
Thank you so much, Senator Wu, for insightful comments and questions. How these countries can overcome their middle income trap, whether Western governance is a recipe to transform these business groups, and also their internal reforms, internationalization, also questions about what kind of research graduate students can study. All these, thank you so much for all these insightful questions. Maybe we can continue with our second commentator. After that, we can all come back and for the authors to respond to your questions. Okay, so let me introduce our second commentator, Professor Preet Aulakh. He's Professor of Strategy and Pierre Lasanda Chair in International Business at the Schulich School of Business, York University, Canada. He holds PhD degrees in both law and business. He has published over 60 articles on topics that include international alliances, technology licensing, cross-border knowledge transfers, and internationalization paths of emerging market firms. His two recent books are Mobilities of Labor and Capital in Asia and Coping with Global Institutional Change, a tale of India's textile and pharmaceutical industries. So, Professor Aulakh, the microphone is now yours.
Thanks, Jing. And it's a pleasure to having read this book and to comment on it. Given my own interest in Asia, in general, Asian business systems, and more particularly about business groups, I was really fascinated to read this book. So what I'm going to do here is, in the short time I have, is to make 3 comments and then have 3 questions for the authors, which we can discuss later on. So the first one, I think, the importance of the book lies in its unifying framework. And I think the Senator has also identified that. So for a long time, we have been hearing that there is a lot of interest in Asian business systems. And people have called it state capitalism. Others have called it pharaoh capitalism. So what this book does is that it kind of brings all those kind of definitions in a unified framework, which can accommodate both the state-owned enterprises and the business groups. So I would say they're kind of almost saying that it's kind of connections capitalism rather than the market-based capitalism. So I found that that unifying concept kind of nicely encapsulate the different definitions or different ideas about what is unique about Asia and Asian business systems. Second, and again, I think in the presentation they made this point, that actually there has been an interesting puzzle in the literature on business groups. And there's been a lot of literature that is studying the origins of business groups, even responding to how business groups go international and how that changes them and so on. But one of the puzzles has been, why do they persist? And I think that is what the authors nicely talked about, because they move beyond the institutional voids perspective. Because once you have most of the earlier thinking was that business groups form because there are institutional voids, so they have their own capital markets and labor markets to overcome some of these institutional voids. But there has always been the question of why have they persisted? And in fact, why have they even expanded in an era where supposedly the institutions in developing countries have become stronger? And I think this, through a connections world, they provide kind of a very nice answer to that puzzle as to why business groups persist. Third, I think the book has been quite perceptive about some of the red flags that they raise regarding business groups. And, they were did not mention it a lot, and this because they spend a lot of time in the book, a lot of space on the Adnani group, showing the growth of the Adnani group, how it became, in a few years, because of political connections, it became from kind of a middling group to one of the largest business groups in India. And in the last 1 month, we have seen how that whole thing has fallen apart. And some of the reasons behind the criticism about that growth and the reasons why kind of investors are fleeing are exactly some of the things that the authors have identified, some of the problems about the connections world and about the business groups. So I think it was kind of quite perceptive about what was happening. And interestingly, is they honed on that same group on which we are seeing a lot of controversy. So I think, overall, I feel that the book kind of provides very good kind of insights about Asian business systems. It provides specific insights about the persistence of business groups and also kind of identify the red flags regarding some of the problems that persist with these business groups as we move forward. So I really enjoyed the book, and I thank the authors for kind of bringing it together. Now I have 3 questions that I want to raise. 2 are kind of more informational, and 1 is a little provocative. So the first question I have is regarding the future of this connections world that you identify, that you've talked about. You do that in your conclusion, and basically the idea there is that the political system has to change in the sense in terms of what the expectations were. And I was kind of wondering, if the political business nexus, if it has worked for so far, why would either one of them want to change their existing status quo? And then I wondered whether, who would be really the agents for change? It's unlikely that the political parties will be agents for change. It is unlikely that the business groups will be agents for change. And then I wondered whether, some of the entrepreneurs from these countries have become very successful in running big business, and their own businesses in Western economies. So we have, a lot of the CEOs of major companies which are of Asian origin. We have firms, and I was wondering, whether you see any role for them to come back and try to change the system rather than the system being changed within. And so I think that's kind of an interesting question: is who would be the change agents in terms of what you are suggesting? Second point is related to innovation, and I think. You provided some very nice data on, R&D investments as a percentage of GDP, and it is very clear that they are nowhere near the GDP. That ratio is nowhere near some of the advanced economies. And I wondered whether, because there is also kind of an alternative view that for developing economies, emerging economies, they don't have to follow the same innovation path. So it doesn't have to be radically new innovations. They could be petite innovations, or there are different pathways to innovation. And I was wondering whether you see evidence of that in your data, that, okay, they may not have produced the blockbuster drug, but they have done enough. So for instance, in the case of pharmaceutical companies, Indian firms have done a lot of kind of innovations in terms of the process of manufacturing and so on in producing generic drugs. So that was my second question. And third is a little bit of a provocative question, but also I think it picks up on the comment that was made by Senator Woo, and that is whether so there is kind of the issue of whether you are when one sees the Asian systems through Western eyes. So it is basically, and there has been some criticism that this is it's a different form. It's a different form of capitalism, which as a Westerners cannot understand. And in more recently, they have been even actually the criticism has been even more drastic, and say the West, you look at the Asia through colonial mindset. And this is, you see a lot of criticism coming out of India, regarding, so even the Adnani group, when the news story broke out, the first big response by the Adnani group was that you don't understand us, and you're not undermining us, but you are undermining the country. So my question was, how would you respond to that kind of criticism, that you're looking at it from a very different mindset, and they were kind of discarded criticism. So I think with those comments, I think I'll stop here, and I think I look forward to your responses and to the discussion as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Professor Aulakh. All these insightful, brilliant questions, comments. So, Saul and Simon, would you like to respond to these questions by Professor Aulakh and Senator Woo?
Sure.
Both terrific sets of questions and issues raised, and really, I don't think either of us is going to have the time to address them fully, and we may be sending them emails and start communication. I do think that what Senator was saying about the positioning of the book and what we're trying to do was, although we didn't think of it at the time, was pretty well spot on. I think he does raise a very important question, which is there enough analytical power in this? I think my answer, surely we've got enough frameworks. I think the point that I would like to come back and say is I don't disagree with that. We do have enough frameworks. But what the Connections world is doing is trying to take a systemic view. That's why it's a Pan-Asian thing. It's a system-wide view. And it is about, as I'm sorry, repeating myself, it is about a political economy equilibrium between a state that plays a bigger role in the economy than we have traditionally seen to the West, and firms which are both much larger relative to the economy than we typically see in the West, and much more diversified. They're not conglomerates. It's not that they're conglomerates, it's the particular ways that they're diversified and cross-owned, which is slightly different. And I think what I would say is that we would want to take account of, that we would want to use all these various tools, but these tools are very siloed, and they're very specific to addressing specific answers to specific questions. But once you start looking at what we're trying to say is, first of all, they understate the cross-market effects of market power and overall concentration. And secondly, they understate the role of the state and political economy effects on the operation of the economy. So I think they would lead you at minimum to nuance how you would think about the application of conventional tools. I think they probably lead you to more. That's the first answer. The second, I'm not going to do all of these, but I'm going to choose maybe one of your questions and then leave two of yours, but Simon after Preet's questions. I'm going to talk very quickly about how the Connections world operates in other countries, that is in the West. I don't think it's really true. I mean, you can read your economic history, and I can read my economic history, but if we look at the big players in the economic history of the industrialization of the West, Tokyo or something like that, the key point is that the role of the state was very, very small, and the role of some sort of competition was quite large. And now, that is not the case, I think it's fair to say, in the economic history of France or Germany. And it's not particularly the case in the economic history of Japan, which imitated much more closely the French type of system. And of course, much of what we're seeing here is derivative of Japan. We were presenting actually last week in France, and people were saying, what do you mean this is different to the West? This is like us. And there is a sense in which that's true. But I think the view of the Anglo-Saxon view of capitalist development is really rather different to this. That's all I would. There's a lot more we can talk about here, but that's what I would say to you. If I can just come back to Preet's comments, and I'll pick up the one on innovation. Yes, well, I think like everything, in a very short presentation, you can't nuance anything. And the book nuances more, and we would want to nuance even more than that. We're really not trying to say, I don't think we're trying to say that Asia is not innovative, or that there cannot be particular forms of innovation in Asia. Both in China and in India, we really do see models of innovation which are not really Western in the conventional sense, and which have been very successful. I think the question is about innovation within the process of growth, or within the process of endogenous growth, and what happens as the economy becomes more developed, and as you're pushed towards requiring innovation which is closer to the frontier, and how effective are these market structures and these political systems at generating this. It's just a different sort of innovation. Or is it possible, and this is, I think, what you're saying, that Asia will be able to, so to speak, take its current models of innovation and push them up to play an intensive role in economic development? I have to tell you, I don't think that's terribly likely, without going into more detail.
Okay. Well, firstly, let me join Saul in thanking both Senator Woo and Professor Aulakh for some wonderful comments, really absolutely spot on and so interesting. And I'm going to just make a stab at a few. By the way, starting just sequentially with Senator Woo's, I quite accept your characterization. There are many things in that literature that you surveyed so elegantly and in such a concise way that we pick up on. As you rightly said, the Asian financial crisis. At that time, I was working in the World Bank, and, a lot of it was the contrast between so-called arm's length capitalism and non-arm's length capitalism, and what happens when the two collide. And that was really, people like Professor Rajan from Chicago threw a lot of light on these issues. And, that was addressed to explaining why there was a sort of explosion, as it were, but it wasn't necessarily about the coordinates of these economies as a whole. And that's what we tried to take it on. I think we really wanted, the pair of us, to stand back and not give any impression that we're saying, my goodness, what gets done in London or what's get done on Wall Street is the right model. I don't think we actually at any point are saying what a right model is. But as both of us as economists obviously have an inherent bias to liking competition. Not necessarily unmitigated competition, raw competition. After all, by the way, many of the business groups compete with each other in very raw and brutal ways. So, we're not really going, but we do think that a feature that's come out of any understanding of economic development over time really underpins how it is this rivalry that drives economies forward. And it doesn't have to be an atomized textbook style economy. So business groups could be rivalrous, are rivalrous, and could play a part in it. But when you get too much market power and too much coalescence of interests between important players like politicians and business groups, and Adani is a stark and not very good, in our view, example, then I think this has deleterious effects on the wider economy. And above all, it really makes it so difficult for Asian policymakers from Nehru onwards to achieve what was always one goal, which was not just growth, but it was a relatively broad-based growth. And so what we see is that this model, if you can call it that, of the connections world is rather efficient in what it does, but it doesn't touch large parts of these economies. And that dualism that we highlighted is as true, paradoxically, of China and Vietnam as it is of India and Bangladesh. very large informal economies, very large numbers of lousy jobs, lousy futures. Now, let me come to a couple of points which are more outside the book, but are more conjectural. Senator Woo and Professor Aulakh both basically asked, what's the way forward, or what's a path forward? Now, in the book, we talk about three things that are really have been promising. The first is not inherently promising. It's not endogenous. It doesn't come out of the system. And that's really breakup. In other words, making groups conform in governance and in tax and other key metrics to behaving in different ways. And the example we gave in the book was Roosevelt in the 30s. And that was incredibly important, and I think by and large, incredibly desirable. But it came out of a very nasty political economic conjuncture, the Great Depression. There's a second example, which we don't play up enough in the book, but which a colleague, Marisako from SAID, has pointed out recently, which of course is Japan. And Japan had these tremendous business groups that really had the economy by the throat, and along came the horrible military defeat and the like, and MacArthur. And MacArthur, what was his playbook? Well, it was Rooseveltism, in a sense. He broke them up. And although the Japanese have allowed business groups to come back into the game from 1997 onwards, it's quite interesting that though they have not managed to create the same market presence and market power before. Now, maybe that's because if you have 50 years of being outlawed, it's hard to go back to the old playbook. And after all, Japan is in most respects quite an open economy. But what I get out of that is that probably the thing that really gets this equilibrium disturbed is something very radical. And I suppose we leave in the book it very much open to doubt whether that will be created endogenously by these systems. One last point, because there's so many things one could go on for a long, long time, and I don't want to bore people. When presenting our book in Madrid the other day, one of the people in the audience said, oh, this reminds me a lot of Latin America between the 1930s and the 1970s. Big business groups, the state, all in bed with each other, some sort of national drive for prosperity. The problem was that the prosperity was for very few. And in the book, which we haven't really talked about in the presentation, I'm afraid it looks a little bit like that, sad to say, in much of Asia right now. Not because in quite a starker form, but because the accumulation of wealth, the inequality of wealth is absolutely staggering. And what one would not wish on any country there is that they would go the Latin American way, that these sorts of inequalities would spawn not sensible and progressive policies for addressing market power, but populist policies, including debasing the currency and essential sort of fiscal incontinence, which ultimately led to the evisceration of many of the business groups, but so too the evisceration of much of their economy. And that's a pretty damn big risk. So I think we take solace in the idea that marginal steps like increased inheritance taxes, which the Koreans learned from the Japanese. Japan has a 55% inheritance tax. Korea's adopted a 50% one. And you begin probably to see some results. The current head of Samsung has declared that the next generation of leadership will not be from the family. His father's estate paid over $21 billion in inheritance tax. And it's measures like this, as well as other tax forms, that can start to, I think, make a big impact. But look, I've already talked too much, but frankly, you raise such incredibly interesting issues that I'm going to blame you both for being so exceptionally insightful for my verbal incontinence. I beg your pardon.
Thank you so much, Simon and Saul, for responding to the comments. And building on what you just said, there is a question from the audience from Professor Daniel Shapiro. It's about South Korea and Japan. Would you agree that South Korea and Japan have successfully made the transition to an innovation economy while not completely dismantling their business groups? If so, what can we learn?
First of all, I would say I'm not a Japan expert. We had to study Japan to some extent to write this book, but I really would prefer, I don't feel capable of answering the question vis-a-vis Japan. On South Korea, I have to tell you, I think the jury is out. I think of all the countries in the region, if you were thinking about policies and the policies that have been enacted and the impact of those policies on innovation, and if you were to look at the data on innovation, South Korea is really doing very, very well. And so you might kind of sit back and say, okay, so Korea is the way forward. But they've been successful, I think, in pushing innovation, but much of that innovation has been within the main business groups and indeed within one big business group, Samsung. And while there are a lot of government policies and there are a lot of initiatives to try and spread innovation out, I won't give you chapter and verse, but there are really a lot of reports in South Korea about the problems of trying to get firms, say, within the supply chains of these large business groups, smaller firms, to undertake innovation where it's not been terribly successful, to put it mildly, and also the whole attempt to create sort of mini Silicon Valleys and all the rest. I think that essentially the jury is out. And it should be out because you've got extravagantly high levels of market power, very high levels of concentration, and it's not clear to what extent policy on innovation would be able to offset this. So I do think, what I think is true is this. I think South Korean government is perhaps the only government in the region that would understand the problem as we've laid it out in this book and has thought about policies of the sort that we have talked about in this book. But I think it's also fair to say that those policies have been at best peripherally or partially successful. I mean, about the time that South Korea looked into addressing the business group issue, so did Israel. And Israel, as it happens, on this at least, has been much more effective than South Korea in prescribing cross-holdings. For example, in Israeli competition law, when a merger is being considered, the criterion is not just the market power in a market, but is the market power, overall market power of the company. So it becomes a criterion in competition policy. So Israelis have gone much further, and there is no doubt of the retreat of business groups in Israel, whereas there really is a doubt about the retreat of business groups in Israel. So what I would say is optimistic, but the jury is out for South Korea.
Thank you. There's another question from Danny Shapiro. You did not mention geopolitics. For example, recent evidence suggests that China is revising its Belt and Road Initiative strategy to focus more on Asia, notably Malaysia and Indonesia. Does this matter?
Well, I'll make a stab at that without, I think, any... I sort of feel a little bit shy of doing that. Yes. I wouldn't be at all surprised if China is revising its Belt and Road Initiative because it's clearly been a path that's had some successes, but it's also been strewn with a lot of debris. And that debris is accumulating, and probably in some cases, for instance, some of the stuff to do with Zambian debt and other sort of highly indebted economies has turned a bit toxic. So a lot of countries that have taken on a lot of leveraging from China through the BRI are basically not able to service those debts, and there's a really large issue around that. Southeast Asia, I don't think I feel well informed enough to give a good answer. It is very clear that in both Malaysia and certainly in Indonesia, there's a strong constituency of support for China in more fora than not. And that was very certainly true when I was working a bit on some energy issues in Indonesia a few years ago under the current president. And I think that's probably fairly fertile ground. But as we know, I mean, China and Southeast Asia is quite difficult terrain. I mean, there's disputes over islands, there's disputes over access. I mean, there's a fairly raw dispute going on between the Philippines and China and the like. So I think it's quite a mixed picture. But I have a feeling that Senator Woo is going to know an awful lot more about it than either Saul and I.
So, Senator Woo, do you have any comments here?
No, I think we should go through the questions. It's about the book, so let's focus on the book.
Okay. Speaking of China, actually, I have a question here. So the question is mainly about the recent crackdowns on the technology education sectors in China. I think some of these policies may have good intentions, to reduce anti-competitive behavior of larger business groups to address social inequality issues. I think all these important issues you have discussed in your book. However, these policies also had a very chilling effect on the private sector's confidence in a regulatory environment in China. So, for example, the stock market in China reacted negatively to the announcement of the Common Prosperity Policy that was aimed to address social inequality. So moving forward, if China were to have policies again to deal with anti-competition and inequality issues, what kind of suggestions would you have for them?
That's a very big question. It's clearly the case that competition policies reduce profits, and so if they're going to work, they really should be reducing stock market valuations if the stock market is working. So in that sense, there's nothing surprising in what you say. And it is the case that we are ultimately talking about on the economic side, breaking up large firms. Not necessarily by government intervention, but by creating incentives for firms to break themselves up. I think business groups have to break themselves up rather than be broken. And one has to create incentives to do that. I mean, I think the issue that we're trying to come to grips with is an economy in which there has been over-internalization. Too much of product markets, across product markets and factor markets are internal to business organizations. And so we need a rebalancing between what used to be called markets versus hierarchies in favor of markets. And I have to say that I think competition policy on its own is very unlikely to do a huge amount about this. Right. Partly because in most Asian economies, competition authorities have limited amounts of teeth, or in China, those teeth are applied for not purely economic, but also for political reasons. And so they may or may not be things may or may not be being done in order to improve markets. There may be other political agenda items at play. I'm not commenting in this particular case about which I don't know enough, but but I think more importantly, the situation that we're in now is one in which competition policy alone isn't enough, for the simple reason that business groups sprawl across the economy. It's this overall concentration point. So that if this is like the Greek feast, the Hydra with multiple heads, and when you cut off one head, another head will come out. And it's not clear that the way to address this is just cut them off head by head. You sort of have to do something at the heart of it. And that, I think, is to do with corporate governance. And so I'm not taking away from competition policy, but I think once you've got the corporate governance right, then competition policy can start to work. Whereas if you haven't got the corporate governance right, it's quite hard to expect competition policy on its own to be.
Can I come in very quickly, Jing, to your question, because it's very interesting. I agree. I'm not quite sure I agree with your characterization or part characterization that government policy towards the tech groups was with a view to sort of stopping anti-competitive behavior. I actually don't think that's right. I think it's really a much more a political play, as Saul has just indicated. I mean, these groups, Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, and the like, particularly the first two, compete very intensely with each other. They don't compete with foreign companies for the most part because they're kept out of the market, but they have a fair scrap with each other. And I think really what's gone on is that the government, the party, has seen that these are extremely powerful entities that are providing highly integrated services, quite innovative, to large numbers of people. And when, one of their founders starts articulating independent views, then that ran into perhaps some sort of opposition from the powers that be. So I actually don't think they were really about anti-competition. To be honest, I don't think they really give much of a toss about that. I think they're quite prepared to go along with oligopoly or duopoly, whatever form of market power by the particular sector. I think on inequality, that's a really big issue. Now, there are two things in the book that we show as well. Inequality has two drivers. Obviously, on income, one of the profoundest bits of the inequality is driven by this duality in the labor market. So essentially, those who don't have good jobs have lousy incomes, and that drives a lot of the income inequality. There are regional disparities and the like. And that's hard to address simply through tax because it's coming from something almost structural. The second inequality, which honestly speaking, I don't see any willingness of the powers that be to address, is wealth inequality. And we show in the book that the most extravagant increase in the number of billionaires and their aggregate wealth is, of course, been in China over the last 20 years. And I really don't see any great willingness as yet to address that, either, say, through the introduction of new taxes, including inheritance, or other sort of more progressive tax rates on wealth. So I think the picture is very much mixed. So I would say that the relationship between government and some of these big business groups is more in the nature of a political play rather than one that's got sort of driven by competition or inequality concerns. I don't know what others would think.
Thank you. It's 10. We're running out of time. But before we end this, I just want to ask Senator Woo and Professor Aulakh, do you want to offer any short comments based on the response of Sam and Saul, and then we'll end the session?
Well, I'm inspired to think more deeply about what the authors have described as the systemic approach to understanding what are really quite well-known problems in Asian economies, and whether the connections world, whether this holistic understanding of the connections world does add to our analytical capacity to not only understand the challenges, but to come up with viable policy solutions and recommendations. So I just want to again congratulate them for inspiring this fresh way of looking at things, and let's hope it leads to 100 flowers blooming.
Great.
Okay. Yeah, I just have a quick, one word, looking for a one-word answer. For all these political systems in Asia, which would they prefer, business groups or SOEs?
Business groups any day.
Okay. Well, why would you say that the business groups? Is it because they give them more of their objectives?
Well, I mean, business groups are far more dynamic. I mean, our book is not really a sort of anti-capitalist rant. It's not saying that these are just sort of parasitical groups or whatever. And Saul, in particular, has done a great deal of work on state-owned enterprises. I mean, the sad reality is that very few of them perform with any degree of efficiency and effectiveness over time. I mean, why don't you say something, Saul, on this? Because you really know a great deal.
Well, I think you said it. I mean, I think we do not. I think business groups have played actually a very important and valuable role for the reason actually you mentioned earlier, which is the the internalization of missing markets and dealing with institutional weaknesses, institutional voids. I don't think state-owned firms can play that role. So, I mean, I think they've just had a very big positive effect on economic development. Our concern is really to do with 20 years later, the entrenchment that comes because of the big role they play.
Thank you all. Sadly, I have to draw this to a close. I want to thank our 4 distinguished speakers for a very insightful discussion on these important issues. I would encourage the audience to read the full book to get more sense of the rich data and a very deep analysis in it. Last but not least, I want to thank our fantastic audience and also our team at SFU BD School of Business for making this event happen. Thank you all. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, great.
This was a pleasure.
Enjoyed it tremendously.
Been fantastic. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. See you.